Will you all pray with me? God of reconciliation, I pray that you once again bless the words of my mouth and the meditations of our collective hearts as we come together this morning. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer, may they simply be acceptable in your sight. May today, this morning, our words and our hearts and our minds simply be enough. Amen. To remind you of the Joseph story from Genesis, I want to read from, you guessed it, the Message paraphrase. So Joseph spoke to his brothers. I am Joseph. Is my father really alive? But his brothers couldn't say a word. They were speechless. They couldn't believe what they were hearing and seeing. Come closer to me, Joseph said to his brothers. So they came closer. I am Joseph, your brother whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't feel badly. Don't blame yourselves for selling me. God was behind it. God sent me here ahead of you to save lives. There's been a famine in the land now for 2 years. The famine will continue for 5 more. Neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me ahead to pave the way and make sure there was a remnant in the land to save your lives. An amazing act of deliverance. So you see, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. He sent me in a place as a father to Pharaoh, put me in charge of his personal affairs, and made me ruler of all Egypt. Hurry back to my father. Tell him, your son Joseph says, I am master of all Egypt. Come as fast as you can and join me here. I will give you a place to live in Goshen, where you'll be close to me. You, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and anything else you can think of. I will take care of you there completely. There are still 5 more years of famine ahead. I will make sure your needs are taken care of. You and everyone connected with you. You won't want for a thing. Not sure I would find that all believable if I were any of his brothers, right? Here's a little bit of what Joseph went through during his capture. Now, when Joseph arrived in Egypt after being sold into slavery to the Ishmaelites, he was again taken and sold to a man named Potiphar, who was a high-ranking official under Pharaoh. Surprisingly, despite being a slave to Potiphar, Joseph develops a good relationship with his master. The Bible describes him as being a successful, really successful in his role as servant. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph. And he became that successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And guess what? He made him overseer of this house and put him in charge of all that he had. Potiphar could sense that there was something special about Joseph and richly blessed him. And it is here that we begin to see God taking a dire situation and using it for a blessing. And when Potiphar is away, Joseph is seduced by his wife. She makes several attempts to seduce him, but Joseph refuses her and refuses to comply. One day, Joseph enters the house and she grasps him by his undergarment. There's kind of some words here, but we can figure out the context in the Hebrew. And as he flees the house, she grasps his undergarment and tears it off. Potiphar's wife seizes the opportunity to spitefully accuse Joseph of sexual assault for turning down her advances. And as soon as she saw that he had left his undergarment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she calls the men of her household and says to him, see, he has brought us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that, I lifted up my voice and cried out. He has left his garment beside me, and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told that same story. The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled. When her husband returns, he is incensed by the story. The master of the house seized Joseph and did what? Imprisoned him again. And yet, as we are told, God continued to work through Joseph, even in prison. And so God was with Joseph and showed him this steadfast love, gave him favor in the sight of his keeper, even in the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph, what? In charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who made the choice to do it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because God was with him. And whatever he did, God made it succeed. So while Joseph was in prison, he had the opportunity to, once again, interpret dreams. And he interprets the dream of Pharaoh's servants who are also in prison. And when the Pharaoh himself has a dream, word gets back to him that there's a young Hebrew in prison who is able to interpret that dream. So what happens? Of course, we know Pharaoh summons Joseph to interpret. And when Joseph predicts that God is about to send the famine into the land of Egypt, Joseph is appointed by the Pharaoh to oversee and prepare for this oncoming plight. So for these 7 years prior, Joseph oversaw the production of superabundant harvests so that he could store up these surpluses for the famine that will follow. People in Egypt and all through the land come to Joseph in order to purchase this grain. Eventually, the word of an abundance of grain in Egypt makes its way all the way up to Jacob in the land of Canaan. So when Jacob learns that there was a grain sale in Egypt, he said to his son, "We look at one another." And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there's grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there so that we may live and what? Not die or perish." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with those brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. So the sons of Israel come to buy among the others who come, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. And it's just very, this is how they end up meeting each other. Therefore, the sons of Israel depart for Egypt. And when they approach, they bow down before him as predicted in Joseph's dream. He recognized them, but they did not recognize him. And he takes this opportunity, seizes this moment, and I think he might just be kind of messing with them, not really for revenge, but he accuses them of being spies. And in order to prove that they are in fact not spies, he devises a plan, but ultimately ends up revealing himself to them. And I read this story, but as I go back further, this is my sort of Joseph's aha or tada moment, but he doesn't do that at all, right? He is kind and hopeful for this relationship that he might reveal and heal with his family. But I'm also wondering, as a pastor, but ultimately a mother, looking back, does anyone have any idea how old Joseph is in this story? Unmute yourself for just a moment if you have any biblical knowledge of how old Joseph is.
He's the youngest brother. I just forget how old he is, but he's definitely the youngest, right?
Do you have any idea how old he is?
I'm going to guess 16.
Yeah, he's 17. So he's 17 years old, having all these dreams, going to prison, not having whatever intimate stuff with the wife of Potiphar. 17. Now, no offense, y'all, parents here. My 17-year-olds are not going to be doing this. My 17-year-olds are, not that they're not capable of forgiveness, but they're certainly, this is a lot of scheming, a lot of God stuff, a lot of higher level thinking happening. And I'm sitting there going, I don't know what 17-year-old I know. I certainly, when I was 17, that's a lot of stuff, right? And there is so much background to this story. And I wanted to provide it, not just so y'all could hear it, but when we post this on YouTube, that some of our friends might not know the story of Joseph and that he was the favorite son of Jacob. and that this is probably why his brothers devised this horrible plan to sell him into slavery in the first place and ultimately followed through with it, right? Horrible things happened to Joseph. And Jacob's life was full of difficulties, but as we read the stories, it was also full of favor, not just from his father, but from God. And if we're reading this story, this is a story about Jacob and Joseph, but it's also a story about God who had favorite regions, favored people as well. Okay. So that's why I wanted to share that whole story, right? And ultimately, Joseph reconciles with his brothers, right, and his family. But in the end, they don't really trust him, right? So I'm going to tell you another story of a different kind of reconciliation, a different choice in how one reconciles their traumatic past, okay? And I want you to suspend judgment, which is hard as people, right? We all have our own judgments and bias. I'm going to ask you to suspend judgment. The Joseph story is one story, right? And it may not be the only way to reconcile. Bruce and Debbie Mathers were musicians, and they mooched their way through life. They were drifters. They barely eked out a living playing with bands, their own bands, living at Motel 6s and Ramada Inns. And it's not surprising that when Bruce was faced with fatherhood and all that implied, he deserted Debbie and their infant son, Marshall Bruce Mathers III. And when their son became old enough to write, he sent letters to his father, and they came back each and every time marked return to sender, each and every time. And this devastated Marshall. After Bruce left, Debbie had another son, Nathan, with another man. He, like Bruce, disappeared out of her life. She was left to travel from place to place, next headed nowhere fast. When she could, she sponged off family. But her life and the life of her sons were often nomadic. They moved back and forth between Missouri and Michigan, often living with family, but sometimes living in their car, homeless, in shelters, in motels. Poverty and neglect were visited on her sons. And even worse, Debbie was physically abusive, especially to the oldest son, Marshall. And this confused boy had no idea what he had done to deserve such a life and those things. And at one point, Debbie abandoned Marshall, leaving him with his great aunt Edna and his uncle Charles. They did the best they could. Back with Debbie, the boy's younger brother, Nathan, had more to do with the parenting of his half-brother than his mother did. If and when he made it to school, he was often bullied. His biggest nightmare was a boy named D'Angelo Berry. At one point, Bailey's physical abuse led to the future Marshall Mathers being in a coma for multiple days. Now, it's not going to surprise anyone that Marshall was a washout at school, reportedly failing 9th grade 3 times before dropping out altogether when he was just 17. He admitted that the only thing he was good at was English. That stood him in good stead when he began forming lyrics. As a kid, he was a natural-born storyteller. He could tell the best stories. And when he discovered hip-hop, that is what changed him. As his upbringing haunted his adult life, he formed a dysfunctional relationship with a woman named Kim Scott. Like his mother, he eventually developed an addiction to drugs. And in 2007, he was hospitalized because of an overdose. With help and eventual therapy and a mentorship, he has been clean and sober since 2008. So friends, I don't know if you've come to the conclusion. This story is about a famous rapper who performed at the Super Bowl on Sunday. Eminem has been sober for 14 years. As Marshall Mathers, he performed on stage as Eminem with Mary J. Blige. And she is another superstar who has more than a decade of recovery under her belt. He is an amazing father to Haley, 26, who graduated from Michigan State University, who in his words has no babies, just a boyfriend. Marshall Mathers lives his life as the rap star Eminem and has used his story of childhood trauma, addiction, and violence to fuel his art. It has healed him, and he has shared his story with a world in need of healing. Forgiveness has not come easy for him, but it has come in a later generation, an iteration of his life, allowing him to be the parent to his daughter that he had never had. Eminem is not Joseph. He is not a biblical story at all. Joseph is a story of one weeping to his brothers that were still unable to trust their own brother when he came back from being enslaved. And while that story is a beautiful redemptive story, so is this story. And friends, I envy folks that can forgive like Joseph. But so many of us carry that trauma in our lives for generations, perpetuating that story of trauma upon trauma upon trauma. Joseph's story is a miraculous one, but so are all the other stories and stories of survivors all around us. Those folks that could have and likely should have died were it not for the grace of God, and those wonderful aunts, uncles, teachers, church folks, community members, producers, and people who saw something great within us. There is redemption in your stories as well, beloveds. Each and every single one of your stories is worth sharing. You, me, and the Marshall Mathers in the world, no matter how beaten down you, we, and they are, whether you have a bully like D'Angelo Bailey or you are your own worst bully, are beloved and are forgiven. Amen.